Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, The Impact of COVID-19 on Human Resources. My name is Lisa McGowan. I serve as the chair for the St. Johns County Chamber's Small Business Council. I'm also the owner of Clearview Coaching, where we provide strategic life and leadership coaching to individuals and businesses. Today's discussion is hosted by the Chamber's Small Business Council and the Economic Development Council. Before we begin, I would like to recognize the sponsor of today's event, Wired to Perform. Before we close today, we will share with you a unique opportunity Wired to Perform is offering Chamber members. We're very pleased to have a distinguished panel of industry professionals with us today to discuss how this pandemic has transformed the workplace, the role of HR throughout this crisis, as well as implications for the future. HR professionals has been on the front lines supporting employers' response to the COVID-19 crisis as businesses, both large and small, have had to adapt and improve remote work policies and procedures. As we think about the reopening of our economy and return to business in the new normal, we must also consider the changes that may be more permanent in how we as small business owners, HR professionals, and leaders will guide employees and our organizations through these changes. Without further delay, I would like to briefly introduce our moderator and panelists. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with Greg Voss, the Chamber's Vice President of Operations. In his role, Greg oversees the day-to-day business operations of the organization, including all HR responsibilities. He works closely with Chamber staff and volunteer leadership to ensure that the benefits of Chamber membership and consistently improving value to its members. And Greg will serve as our moderator today. On our panel, I'd like to introduce Shana Ryan, President and CEO of Conceptual HR Solutions. Shana has been in the human resources field for over 15 years in all roles of management and holds a BAS in supervision and management. In May of 2017, Shana launched Conceptual HR Solutions in order to help small businesses with their HR needs. Shana is an ambassador for the St. Johns County Chamber and serves as the consulting vice chair with the Small Business Resource Network. Welcome, Shana. We're also joined by Rusty Bozeman, principal of Workplace Synergistics, a management and organizational development consulting firm based here in St. Augustine in St. Johns County. For over 25 years, Rusty held senior leadership roles in all aspects of HR for large publicly traded and private organizations. He built his career establishing human resources strategy in the information technology, healthcare, and real estate sectors, and developed expertise in the areas of strategy development, executive team alignment, organizational and leadership development, and talent assessment and effectiveness. Thank you, Rusty, for joining us today. I'm also pleased to introduce John Dickinson, a partner with Constangy, Brooks, Smith, and Profit LLP. John brings a strong background in the areas of employment litigation, wage and hour compliance, and labor relations. He is one of the few lawyers to hold board certification in labor and employment law for the Florida Bar. Thank you, John, for sharing your time with us this afternoon. And finally, I have the pleasure of introducing Gary Wheeler. Gary is also a partner with Constangy, Brooks, Smith, and Profit. Gary has represented employers exclusively in both the private and public sectors for over 20 years. His experience includes successfully defending employers in all aspects of law and employment law. He's a frequent lecturer at seminars for employers and provides in-house training on workplace issues to supervisory and management employees. Welcome, Gary. Now I'd like to hand the program over to our moderator, Greg Voss, to start our discussion.
Thank you, Lisa. So as we start, I would like to ask each of our panelists to speak for just a few minutes to give our audience a general overview of your areas of expertise. And as you're speaking and providing our audience with information, please keep in mind we would like to get to as many questions as possible in the Q&A portion of this webinar. So I'd like to ask Shana to begin, followed by Rusty, then John, and finally Gary. Shana, please begin.
Allowing me to be a part of this webinar. So I work exclusively with small companies and that have 49 employees or less. So I think we can all agree that communication is huge, especially during this pandemic. And a lot of times communication is something that small businesses struggle with. So this is definitely going to be a new thing that might actually need to be scheduled in by leadership and ownership and management to ensure that this is done, because communication with your team during this is extremely essential. So additionally, changing the way employees are managed is also going to be a little different. So instead of having people physically there and holding them accountable, it's going to be more important to manage by goals and projects. So ensuring that assigned tasks have deadlines is very important and clearly communicated. So I recommend there's an app called Top Tracker that's extremely efficient in helping employees manage their time. It will also show what they're working on throughout the day. So if you don't have something like this in place for your team, I highly recommend you get one. So a lot of employees are going to struggle without constant accountability. You may have someone that thrives in an office or work environment, have a really strong work ethic in that environment, but you might see a struggle at home due to the constant distractions that we all have at home. So, and not to mention, most of us have children at home now too. So we're suddenly now a teacher trying to help with schoolwork and trying to continue working efficiently. So that can be really overwhelming, and having flexibility with your employees is crucial. And depending on your business model, you may need your employees to be available during a specific time or a day for emails, phone calls, etc. So just make sure that this is communicated in writing and you don't just tell them verbally, or worse, assume that they just know. Sending a simple follow-up email to confirm your discussion is all that is needed. So if you are having consistent problems with the availability, call and find out why. Try to work through it, dive in deep and see if there's another solution, and encourage and empower your management team to do the same. So, and unfortunately, there's always going to be a few that either bend the rules or are just not able to make that transition to a work from home position, and you're seeing issues. So if all these methods have been exhausted and you have tried everything to work with them, it is okay to proceed with disciplinary action, because at the end of the day, you still have a business to run. So ensuring that your work from home policy is in place and you have a disciplinary policy in place that act together is extremely important. And once these policies have been finalized, you need to make sure it has been communicated, reviewed, and signed off by all of your employees. So just keep in mind that saying nothing is still saying a lot of things. So you must be proactive in your communication, and retaining your current employees is key. So this will ensure that your business is in a good, strong position for when the rebound occurs.
Thank you, Shana. All right, Rusty, you're up.
Hi, everyone. It's good to be with you. Thank you for the opportunity. I thought I would just go through a little bit about how we are currently working with clients to help them through this crisis. I mean, what you can see is, as soon as we had the shelter in place order, a lot of my clients called. They were seeing reductions in demand, reductions in spending, conserving cash, which usually means layoffs, furloughs, shutting down certain parts of the business. They had supply and infrastructure disruption. Of course, HR folks are worried about the health and safety of employees, as well as how to get people remote. And everybody's dealing with uncertainty and fear. And one of the big challenges we have is how we unfreeze employees and teams. Next slide, please. If you look back over the past 100 years, HBR did a study looking at what companies seem to emerge best coming out of a downturn. And what they found was it's those companies that were able to balance conservatism and operational efficiency with proper investments in the right areas. Please, next slide. So our disciplined approach that we've been using with clients is taking the understanding that every business has a strategy and every business wants results. And typically the results depend on what happens in that little middle section there. Sometimes in the capital area, but a lot of times in how we manage the people processes. So if we go to the next slide, I can show you first that when we're in a crisis like this, design is one of the most important things that we can focus on first. How are we going to adjust the strategy of the organization? In particular, how are we going to express the strategy in people terms? Next slide, please. So right now we're all in a situation where we have to make hard decisions. A lot of the work I've been doing is with my clients and helping them through furloughs and reductions in force. Certainly realignment is important. Next, please. So what we've done, and I think works very well, is applying a discipline to this. Assemble a crisis team and map out the best and worst case scenarios. And then of course, what comes with that is a thoughtful communication plan. Next. Adapt your business strategy to meet the different circumstances, which is something that we're all trying to go through right now, but do it intentionally. Do it with a plan in mind. Next. Obviously, at this point, we want to examine the behavioral makeup of our leadership team. One of the issues that Harvard Business Review found in their study was that in a crisis, a lot of people retreat, they get really conservative, they shut down investment, and they pull themselves back in spending and capital expense to the point that it's very difficult for them to make up any ground coming out of it. You really want to pay attention to your leadership behavioral profiles. Some are going to be very conservative, some are going to be very innovative and risk tolerant. And so making sure that you have the right people in the right areas is important. Next. And of course, once we have all this figured out, we have to modify our operating model and then consolidate teams. This is a great opportunity to identify the right internal people to fill some of those roles. And obviously, we want to communicate that new model. At this point, you can go to the next slide. At this point, we really want to focus on the managers. Next slide, please. So everything that we're doing from here on out, we're putting a lot of reliance on the managers to keep people in place, keep them focused, help them feel reassurance, as well as get clarity around what's expected of them. So you can go to the next, please. So we need to try to find opportunities to identify individuals that can grow, possibly into leadership development capabilities. This is really important that we have self-awareness of our managers. You know, you've got to get yourself emotionally sound before you can actually start to be a good leader for others. So one of the things we've been doing is building self-awareness with managers and helping them understand that some of their employees are going to need a lot more reassurance. Some of their employees are going to need a lot more information. Other employees are going to need to be left alone and have the opportunity for independence. And so that's really important as we go forward, making sure that we're catering that communication. And then making sure that we're protecting the culture, reinforcing those values. And if we don't align the culture with the strategy is not going to work. I think it was Drucker that said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. If we could go to the next slide, please. So then we get into hiring, and you can go to the next slide. This is a look at the unemployment claims during the year of 2020. What I want everyone to remember is before we went into this situation, it was very, very difficult to hire people. We were starting a 10-year drought of labor. And what was driving a lot of that was the baby boomer generation exiting the workforce. And we really didn't have, in many sectors, particularly in skilled labor, did not have a lot of people behind them. Those demographics are still true. So what's it going to be like when we come out of this? Go ahead and next one. So we need to really look at the jobs that we have if we're going to hire, and I know most of you are not hiring now, but at some point you might. And so do we just hire the jobs that we've always had, or do we reevaluate those jobs? And do we make sure that they're shifting? We've been hiring surgically for certain positions, making sure that we have the right people in the right place. And this is a really great time for us to tweak the interviewing, screening, and selection process, as well as onboarding. This is a heat map of an average resume that comes through, and studies have shown that recruiters only spend about 6 seconds reviewing each resume, and managers spend less than 10 minutes of prep. So that type of rigor is not going to be very useful as we go forward, especially if you have that many people out of work. You put an open position out there, you're likely to get hundreds and hundreds of applicants. So how are you going to go through that effectively? Finally, we need to make sure that we are maintaining an accurate measure of the HR metrics that we find most important. So that might mean something different than what we're used to. What does remote engagement look like? One of the best ways to measure that is to look at alignment of each employee against the job, their manager, the team, and the organization and the culture. Those are the key areas that drive engagement or disengagement. So if you can really focus on those, that's important. And then, of course, a lot of the things that used to produce engagement with employees may not now. So there might be new things that we have to identify in ways to measure the effectiveness of engagement of our workforce. Next, please. So ultimately, what we do is we help organizations understand what they need to do right now. We are an HR human capital consulting firm. We also do training and development, and we do talent assessment. What we see most commonly in missteps like this is that organizations get responsive. They're not intentional. They don't have employees aligned to their strategy. Leaders are so concerned with the business results, they don't pay attention to the employee struggles. And then maybe these reductions in force or furloughs are not handled very well. And we always forget that the people who are not being let go are watching everything we're doing. And so they're deciding how much we respect them based on how we treat their friends who are exiting. And then we need to really make sure that hiring teams are reevaluating requirements and needed skills. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rusty. Really appreciate that. A lot of great information in those few minutes. John Dickinson, you're up.
In the next few minutes, let's address reductions in force, other steps management has been taking, and litigation avoidance in our current situation. On the workplace, like no other event in history, perhaps one of the biggest changes that we're seeing is involuntary reductions in our workforce, either temporary or permanent in nature. It's generally recognized that labor costs percentages average 20 to 35% of gross sales of the average business. Of course, percentages do vary by industry. It can be as much as 50% of gross sales. Secondly, the biggest cost of doing business is often labor, which can account for as much as 70% of total business costs. That includes wages, benefits, and taxes. Benefits alone can account for 30% of the overall labor costs. So the effects of stay-at-home orders and quarantines have, in some cases, shut business down. There's absolutely no sales. There were no people walking in the door, and demand has dropped drastically. And it's also certainly reduced business in many other cases, with a resultant precipitous drop in the demand for our past staffing levels. Can we just remember that not too many weeks ago, we were at an historic unemployment rate of 3% or so. And right now, I think we're right around 15%. We've witnessed furloughs and layoffs In other words, reductions in force. So a reduced workforce may be the new normal for what's going to take place the next few months, or maybe for many, many months. We'll just have to wait and see. We may not see the unemployment rate rise below 3% or even around that for many years. We'll just have to wait and see. All that aside, we believe that employers of all sizes, small and large, need to consider that cutting jobs, reducing hours, and reducing pay and benefits comes with serious legal risks. Such actions that management takes are what I call, quote, adverse, end quote, to the employee. And such actions can trigger lawsuits for such things as discrimination, breach of contract, retaliation, wage and hour violations, loss of benefits, and other statutory violations such as federal and state WARN statutes. The new normal is that many employers will have to deal with the pandemic by navigating a complex array of legal issues associated with reductions of labor costs for many years. We as a law firm recommend that you have a plan, and that plan should be in writing, and it should address such things as the need to reduce labor costs, the options you have considered to take in addressing the need to reduce labor costs, and the bases of your decisions that you make. And those steps should be documented in writing, in our opinion. Also, like never before, employers will continue, at least we believe for the next 6 to 10 months, to monitor and be aware of changes in government guidance and laws which are occurring on an almost daily basis. I'll just tell you, we spend, as lawyers in our law firm, and there are around 250 of us across the nation, every day just trying to stay up with new developments in this area. And I'm sure many of the attendees on this webinar are having the same problem. It changes almost minute by minute, and it's very complicated in nature. In conclusion, let me summarize by saying the employment-related COVID-19 litigation has already begun, and we all need to be prepared for it. For example, a lawsuit was filed on April 6, 2020 in Illinois, claiming that an employee died by contracting the virus while working. Claims of negligence and disregard for the safety of the employees have been made in that case. We've also heard about employees filing lawsuits claiming that their reduction in pay and layoff was done in a discriminatory fashion and that they need to have relief for such adverse action. So, take steps, we recommend, take steps to protect your business while we are all focused right now today on maintaining 6 feet apart, trying to keep our mask on or clean our desk in our areas where we are at home, trying to work at home sometimes. We need to realize that an eye must be maintained on what our actions that we take today are going to result in the form of potential legal disputes tomorrow. Always keep in mind that what we do today will have a ripple effect and potential trigger litigation. And with that, I'll end and turn it back over to Greg.
Thank you, John. Thank you for that information. Gary.
Thank you, Greg. In the last month, we've probably all witnessed or even been a part of the most sweeping workplace changes in our lifetime. By the end of today, and since just March 6th, Congress has passed and President Trump will have signed 4 separate laws designed to confront the coronavirus and the economic fallout from it. And let me just recap those 4 pieces of legislation. On March 6th, President Trump signed the Coronavirus Preparedness and Response Supplemental Appropriations Act. This act provides $8.3 billion in funding for a variety of purposes, including more than $3 billion for research and development of vaccines and therapeutics. On March 18th,
the Families First Coronavirus Response Act was signed into law. This law provides emergency paid leave and expanded family and medical leave to certain employees of employers with fewer than 500 employees. Then on March 27th, the CARES Act was signed into law. It included $349 billion for the Paycheck Protection Program, which provides that a business can receive, or should have said that in the past tense, could have received a forgivable or low interest loan of up to $10 million in an effort to provide cash flow assistance to employers who maintain their payrolls during the COVID-19 crisis. The CARES Act also loosens the requirements for workers to receive unemployment insurance benefits. And today, President Trump is expected to sign the Paycheck Protection Program and Healthcare Enhancement Act, which provides an additional $322 billion for the small business loan program that I just went over, and that quickly reached its limits under the CARES Act. In addition to this historic legislative action, the president and governors across the country have been busy drafting and implementing executive orders. Perhaps the one that's the most important to this group on this call is Governor DeSantis's April 1st Executive Order 2091. The order states in part, all persons in Florida shall limit their movements and personal interactions outside of their homes to only those necessary to obtain or provide essential services or conduct essential activities. Listen to that. If you woke up from a month-long coma and read that order, you would probably think Governor DeSantis had completely lost his marbles by seemingly placing the burden on citizens who are outside of their homes to demonstrate that they are, one, providing or obtaining essential services, or two, conducting essential activities. But when you look at it in the context of the larger picture, you would know that Florida was the 34th state to implement a safer at home or stay at home type order. And for those of us who've been knowing, you'll see that his order was fairly standard and actually a little bit looser in its provisions than many other states. So as we sit here today, the question of who is allowed to work and what businesses are allowed to operate hinges on whether the governor's order recognizes that business as an essential service. In a recent interview, Attorney General William Barr indicated his willingness to take a position on lawsuits that citizens might file against their states over these orders. Barr said, quote, "You know, the idea that you have to stay in your house is disturbingly close to house arrest. I'm not saying it wasn't justified. I'm not saying in some places it might still be justified, but it's very onerous as is shutting down your livelihood," end quote. So the dizzying pace at which these laws were drafted and passed is leading to some unintended consequences. Just Wednesday, CNBC published an article on a small business owner of a spa who obtained a PPP loan. The title of the article hints at the overall problem. The headline reads, "She got a forgivable loan. Her employees hate her for it." The spa, based in Washington, obtained a loan of over $200,000. Once the owner explained to the employees that their paychecks would continue in full, even though they couldn't work at all, those employees were upset. The reason? They stood to receive more through enhanced unemployment than they would directly from their employer with uninterrupted pay. So while most of the money she received from the loan would go towards payroll, she was going to use a portion of the proceeds, or will be using a portion of the proceeds, to pay rent to keep her business open so she can function in the future. In some cases, no good deed goes unpunished. Back to you, Greg.
All right, thank you, Gary. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to bounce several questions off of each of you. And I'm going to start with you, John. With the economic conditions being what they are, many people are being laid off from their jobs. What are some of the things employers need to consider both professionally and legally when handling layoffs?
Thank you, Greg. Well, you're going to have to, as I said before, have a plan, a layoff plan if you're going to reduce your workforce. And when you develop that plan, you're going to have to consider your handbook and your policies and what do those policies say with respect to reducing the workforce. Your handbook may not address that, but if it does, that handbook needs to be considered. If you have a union environment, your collective bargaining agreement most likely will have some provisions in it that would be implicated in a reduction in force situation. Very importantly is whenever you consider the adverse action of a layoff, you have to consider the possible effect of treating some people one way and not others, the selection of certain employees and not others for that adverse action. And when there is a distinction made where some people are chosen and others not, you have the potential for a discrimination claim or a collective action involving a number of people in a protected characteristic to make an assertion that they were selected for the layoff instead of others because of the protected status they're in. For example, the aged or folks who have a health-related issue, individuals who may have been on family medical leave in the past, or pregnant. You have to look at such questions as gender and race and national origin when you make your selection. And you're going to need to be able, if you're challenged, to justify why certain folks were chosen and not others. Now, obviously, if everybody is laid off, the discrimination element goes away. But when there's not everyone that's affected by a layoff, you have those potential discrimination claims arise. You also, depending upon your size, have to be concerned with state WARN statutes. So that's a statute that's called the Worker Adjustment Retraining Notification Act, or WARN, under federal law that applies to workplaces that have 100 or more employees and a certain number of people are being affected by the layoff. So there are certain states that have what we call mini WARN, but depending upon your size, you may have to concern yourself with such things as the obligation to give prior notice before you institute a layoff. So in summary, from a legal and professional standpoint, a layoff is a very complicated process, and it has to be carefully planned and carefully documented and carried out. So just be very careful when we do that, because as I said earlier, a layoff is an adverse action against employee or group of employees. Greg?
Thank you, John. Shane, I want to come over to you with this particular question. Staying connected to coworkers in a remote environment is really challenging at best. What are some things employers can do to foster a culture of collaboration while working in a more dispersed environment?
So yes, this is a tricky one and new for a lot of businesses. So there's an app called Slack that is really good. It is an invite only and would allow employees to either use it on their phone. It's a mobile app, or they can use it on their computer. It is similar to something like a Microsoft Teams. So a lot of companies are using that. So there's different, applications out there that can definitely be implemented. And there's also things that you can do as far as maybe a virtual coffee break once or twice a week. Just have someone that is in charge of making sure it's on everyone's calendars and communicated to where employees can get together. So it's really important just to show that you care. So management, leadership, ownership can send out handwritten thank you cards to employees is an idea as well. You can also host some type of spirit week And you can get employees, families, roommates, even their pets involved. So this can be posted up the company Facebook page, or if you have a Slack or any type of virtual internet job or company board, then that can be implemented there. You can also, I thought a good idea would be to do some sort of book club. So get a book for all of your employees, whether it's just through the Kindle app or Audible or however it is, and maybe something like time management that we all have our own struggles with, and talk about it once a week. Just a way to make sure there's constant communication, not only between management and employees, but also between employees as well. And then there's always the famous Zoom virtual happy hours. You can't go wrong with those.
All right, great, Shannon. What was, and can you just clarify what the name of that app was that you suggested?
It's Slack, S-L-A-C-K.
Got it. Thank you so much for that. Gary, I want to come over to you here because you discussed a little bit the CARES Act in your remarks. So if a company receives funds from the CARES Act, can that company terminate employees that they had already planned on terminating to begin with?
Yes, Greg. The reason for the termination of an employee under the CARES Act is not something that will be examined. But it's important to remember that any termination under the CARES Act may impact your company's ability to qualify for loan forgiveness. Since the loan is intended to cover payroll costs, the company must maintain a minimum of 75% of the average of the 2019 monthly payroll for a 60-day period after the loan is funded in order to have the loan forgiven. So if a company lays off an employee between February 15th and April 26th, the company will have until June 30th to restore the full-time employment and salary level and still qualify for loan forgiveness.
Thank you, Gary. Appreciate that information. Rusty, I want to get you in here on this particular question. Many people have found themselves working from home, of course, for much longer periods of time. What advice would you give to employers trying to adapt their policies and procedures to account for an extended period of time for their employees working remotely?
Thanks for the question, Greg. Yeah, we're dealing with this quite a bit right now. I go back to this idea, and I've heard it mentioned by several others, that you really need to have a comprehensive, intentional strategy that is backed up by a written plan. Doing things piecemeal or in a reactive manner, my experience really creates more confusion and anxiety for everybody. I've gone through lots of layoffs as a head of HR, and I can tell you that there's a right way to do it and there's a damaging way to do it. There's a recent study that SHRM produced that showed that a third of employers right now actually had no plan for disaster recovery or business continuation, and of the 2/3 that did, over 50% of them had nothing relating to communicable disease, which is pretty understandable. And of course, having that plan and making sure that plan is communicated is really important. I always take the approach that I need to make it somebody's job. When I was running HR departments and we had hurricanes bearing down on us all over the state or in the eastern part of the country, we usually would have a team or a set of individuals whose responsibility it was to track all the developments, make sure that we have a plan, make sure that we're thinking through contingencies, best and worst case scenario. We have an ongoing communication cadence and different methods for getting information out to relevant employees or people affected. So I think you really want to have something similar here. You're going to have morale issues. Communication's a struggle. 2/3 of the employers in the SHRM study found that to be true. 35% reported productivity issues. And think about it, it's a lot on working parents. If you have two parents that work, you're now trying to do remote work while also having children home from school that you're trying to homeschool, and that's quite a bit. It's possible that you have essential employees that are in the office, but you're not in the office. I was talking with someone at Ring Power yesterday, and they have that same issue. And now is not the time to get conservative with support and resource needs. One of my clients' reaction was to shut down all spending, but then they put 60% of their workforce on a remote basis. But what that means is they weren't actually providing the support of the investment for them to be effective to be able to work at home. And so be strategic about areas where you're going to cut back spending, and there might be cases where you want to increase or invest. The other thing is, we've mentioned some collaboration tools. Slack is a great tool, but there's a ton of them. And what I find is that companies don't usually select one tool. They leave it up to the different teams or leaders to come up with their preferred tool, which means that you have multiple teams working from multiple platforms. Everything from WebEx Teams, Microsoft Teams, Jabber, Zoom, Uber Conference, Slack, SharePoint, shared files. This gets really confusing, creates a lot of friction, and can be a source of frustration and even further loss of productivity. Obviously, you want to adjust policies around scheduling, pay, leave, both paid and unpaid. Data security is an issue. You've got people now logging in from home. How are you protecting that data? If I have people working at home, workers' comp could potentially become an issue if they get injured. And then, of course, you've got hourly workers working at home. You have to be concerned about whether they inadvertently work overtime that doesn't get recorded. There's really a whole host of things that need to be thought through. The biggest thing I could suggest is making sure that you make it someone's job to think through all these issues and put it into a comprehensive plan.
All right, Rusty, great information, great advice. John, I want to circle back to you with my next question. There's some confusion in the difference between layoffs and furloughs, and can you help people understand the difference between the two?
Sure, Greg, and there is a lot of confusion over this. As a matter of fact, historically, the term layoff meant to temporarily dismiss, just like furlough is today, a temporary leave of absence. So the term furlough has been bounced around in different ways for many, many years. But in today's parlance, a furlough is used most often as a leave of absence that is unpaid and that is on a temporary basis, or at least intended to be temporary at the outset of it. It may turn into something that's long-term or even a layoff, but it is a leave of absence, whereas a layoff is a reduction in force that is meant to be permanent in nature, where there's an actual severance of the employment relationship. Your question is good because oftentimes an employer may use a term furlough that will not be understood by an employee. And so we recommend that when we do communicate with our employees, that we use terminology that they are accustomed to. And if we want to use furlough, we would at least explain to them that that term is intended to mean a leave of absence on a temporary basis, or at least at the present time intended to be on a temporary basis. And it usually is without pay, although many employers will allow employees during a furlough to have access to and to spend down any accrued paid time off that they may have, on their books. So that's the difference between the two.
Thank you, John. That was extremely insightful. Shana, I want to come to you with this. While most businesses and HR professionals have been focused on crisis response through the last several weeks, continuity of operations remains important for many of them. What are some ways small businesses can focus on continuing operations while also maintaining a concern for employees' emotional and physical health and wellness?
So in follow-up to what Rusty said about employers and businesses not wanting to invest into anything for their employees, I agree with him that this might not be the time to do it. Obviously, you want to spend wisely, But doing employee check-ins is incredibly important because with a lot of the workforce working from home, employees may need small basic items to do their jobs, but they've been so busy and they're just awesome people that they haven't asked and they're just making do. So some examples in regards to that would be headsets, extra monitor, could they use a printer? Are they having computer issues? Can they access VPN without issues, or is it constantly being kicked off and they're having to log back in? Maybe they could use an extra USB or HDMI cord. So just taking the time to ask that they have everything that they need to do their jobs efficiently, these small things can make a huge difference. In regards to their emotional health, a lot of small employers may not have any type of EAP, which is an employee assistance program, but Optum right now has a COVID-19 emotional support resources available to everyone. So I can get you this link, but I'm sure you can Google it as well. But it's an Optum Employment Support Helpline also, and it's a free of charge to anyone that's available. And you can share this with employees, encourage them to share with their family and friends. And what it does is gives access to caring professionals who will connect them to people and resources. And it's available 24 hours a day and 7 days a week. So that's really helpful. And in regards to the physical health and wellness, Headspace is an app that's out there, and it has virtual meditation, and they have a platform called Weathering the Storm. So that could be something that you can just push out as knowledge. So it's there and available to employees. So this includes meditations, sleep and movement exercises. And physical health, the Peloton app actually has a lot available. It is more than just a spin bike. So they have several workouts available, and it's free for 90 days. So with this, you could set up maybe some competition for team building as well. So that would help in the physical and, mental well-being of everyone.
Shana, thank you. Thank you for that. Gary, I'm going to come over to you with actually, it's a hypothetical situation. Assume an employer has an employee who is 68 years old and healthy, but for his own safety, because he's over 65, the employer would like to send him home until the pandemic blows over. The employer figures that he would let this person use his PTO time so he won't lose any compensation. Can they do that?
No, that would be a violation of the Age Discrimination and Employment Act. The EOC does say that you can offer an employee the option of telecommuting, assuming the job would allow for that. If that's a possibility, it would help to ask him whether he would accept that offer. And you probably already know this, but if he wasn't doing his job remotely, he's working, so you would have to pay him his regular wages during that time. You wouldn't be allowed to require him to use his PTO. If you require him to use his PTO for an illegal leave, then he would be losing compensation. He would be losing that PTO.
All right, thanks, Gary. We got time for a few more questions, and we're gonna roll through these. Rusty, we have discussed some of the challenges of a remote workforce. What can employers do in terms of designing accountability standards that make sense and are effective without creating an overburdensome situation on employees?
So one of the things that I would strongly recommend is, this is a great time to implement planning and scheduling. Make sure that you're setting clear expectations for remote workers. Build a communication rhythm. I think you should have regular standing scheduled meetings where you're checking in with them. The format I typically use is your stuff, my stuff, our stuff, how's it going? So I ask them, what do you want to talk about? What burning issues do you have? Here are some issues that I have that I want to give you or talk with you about. big rock issues that we need to discuss, ongoing projects, and then a check-in. How's it going? Those are really, really helpful. And I think that the fact is, face-to-face communication is the richest form of communication. And if we're doing these things over the phone, we're missing a lot of the information that we'd normally get if we were face-to-face. I also think that helping to set milestones and targets so that I could manage my employees for substance or deliverables rather than whether they're sitting at their desk on a 9-to-5 schedule. There's going to need to be some flexibility with that, especially if you're a working at home parent. That gets to be pretty tricky. I think we've all seen the people on TV or in other conferences where we have dogs walking around in the background, things like that. So that means don't be a helicopter boss. Let them kind of manage their outputs and maybe be flexible with how they get that done. But the other thing, and I'm really happy to hear Shana touch on this, is that emotional intelligence piece. You're not going to get good productivity from remote employees or remote teams if there isn't trust. So we have to dial up our own self-awareness, and we have to get to know our employees. We have to understand what they need from us. Do they need more information? Do they need more independence? Do they need more reassurance? Do they need a more steady pace, or do they need to have more variety? All these things are things that we're going to need to help them figure out. And then how do we keep them motivated? And then, of course, I don't just check on productivity. I also check on them emotionally, like I said, at the end of each of those sessions. And then obviously we want to connect with collaboration tools every chance we get, just to name a few.
Yeah, Rusty, thank you for that. Probably got time for a couple more questions. John, I want to go to you with this. If a company decides to reduce compensation and hours worked as a result of COVID-19, are there any employment law considerations that should be taken into account?
Well, certainly there are. Generally speaking, when it comes to non-exempt hourly paid employees, you can reduce their schedule and their hours of work, and you can also reduce their hourly rate as long as you do not drop them below minimum wage. Any kind of cut like that, you have to realize it's going to affect morale. So the way you communicate that is very important. We recommend that nothing be done retroactively. And in other words, if you're going to make a change, you put the employee on notice in a clear fashion in advance of the actual institution of the change, so that the employee has an opportunity to understand before he or she performs work what the change is going to be. When it comes to salaried employees, assuming there's no contract of employment that requires a certain salary level, and so that the salary has been agreed to, but it's not in the form of a written contract, then again, prospectively, a change can be made to the salaried worker's salary as long as we maintain the salary level that's required for the exempt status under the Fair Labor Standards Act. The white-collar exemptions in the Fair Labor Standards Act requires a certain salary level to be maintained, and that we maintain that and pay it free and clear. The last thing I'll note is that for the salaried worker, you have to pay the entire salary if the worker performs any work within a work week. So you can reduce the pay level as long as you do the salary, and you can reduce the hours of work. But you want to make sure when you deal with salary changes, if there's in any work week with a work any part of the week, you're going to have to pay the salary that they were set and agreed upon beforehand. So those are kind of the guidelines that we must follow. Now, in every state, it's a little different, but the information I just gave you is based on Florida law and the federal law.
Thank you, John. I'm going to go to Shana, and then I'm going to ask the final question to Gary. For you, Shana, though, look into the future if you can a little bit. And in your opinion, what does the future of work look like, and how will businesses and their HR departments have to adapt?
So I believe the future will definitely be less office-based and much more remote. a lot of companies have put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into ensuring their employees can work from home. And I think a lot of employees will want to do that, especially once kids are back in school. So just continuing to be managed by specific goals, targets, projects, metrics, things of that nature, rather than employees being physically present, I think is definitely how that's going to, change. And as far as when onboarding and things like that, I think there's going to be a big increase in all the personality testing, whether it's DISC, Myers-Briggs, things of that nature. I think that there's going to be a big uptick in that as well.
Okay, thank you, Shana. And Gary, we have an audience question I'd like to close with here. Any suggestions on handling service industry employees resisting change in job duties? No change in pay, though.
Yeah, I think the key here is just good communication. The employer, although doesn't have an obligation to do this, it always goes over better from a morale standpoint when an employer explains the reason for the change is being made. So it's a good idea for that employer to not only maybe respond to that employee's question, but to maybe get some other similar questions about concerns and frustrations that similar employees may share, and address those in a communication and a question and answer position. Doing that doesn't express any kind of weakness on the employer's part. It just shows that they're listening to their employees, and that the change is being made for a solid business reason. And generally, even if the employees are ultimately unhappy with it, they're less unhappy than they would be if you hadn't gone through that step. So that's a positive step in the right direction.
Gary, I appreciate it, and that is going to be the last word for today. To our participants and attendees, you've seen the contact information for each of our panelists, so please take advantage of contacting them. If you need that information sent, keep in mind that this webinar is being recorded and will be distributed to our members as well. So before we close today, we'd like to acknowledge today's sponsor, Wired to Perform, and invite you to visit wiredtoperform.com/COVID. That's wired, the number 2, perform.com/COVID. To access the Wired to Perform platform for 90 days for free. Wired to Perform offers employees an opportunity to enhance work from home operations by leveraging behavioral insights for greater employee engagement, productivity, communication, and collaboration. At the organizational level, the platform can help managers understand employee performance to help increase productivity and improve the workplace experience, both in our current disrupted work environment and upon transition as we return to a more traditional or hybrid work environment. We also encourage all St. Johns County small business owners to complete the Florida Disaster Assessment Survey online at www.floridadisaster.biz. The information collected in these surveys assists state officials to determine the economic impact of the COVID-19 crisis across Florida. The information is submitted by St. Johns County businesses will inform our recovery efforts locally. Please visit the Chamber's website at www.sjcchamber.com and follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram for information and resources to assist you through this crisis and into recovery. So on behalf of the Chamber's Small Business Council and Economic Development Council, I would like to thank our host, Lisa McGowan of Clearview Coaching, and each of our panelists, Shana Ryan of Conceptual HR Solutions, Rusty Bozeman of Workplace Synergistics, and Gary Wheeler and John Dickinson of Constangy Brooks Smith & Profit for sharing their knowledge and expertise with us today. Again, today's discussion was recorded, and the recording will be uploaded to the Chamber's website, playback at a later date. Thank you to all of our members and guests for your participation in the webinar today.